Kelly, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So firstly, why did you decide to hone in on this particular subject, given how dangerous the territory is, and also that one would imagine from the onset people may be resistant to talk about their experiences as gang members?
Absolutely. I think that one of the main things that drew me to this particular topic is that we often, as you said, we look at sort of how young people get drawn into gangs and the risk factors for joining gangs, but we don't actually know very much about how people are able to exit gangs. So there's this assumption, which unfortunately sometimes is true, that people aren't ever able to exit. But what my study shows is that, in fact, they can. And I was really interested in that idea, and the idea of resilience, that people can and do change their lives.
And those who you spoke to, the interviewees, how many people actually made up your cohort as a sample? And, what were they saying? What prompted them to actually leave these gangs?
So I interviewed 12 former gang members from the Cape Flats, and I think what's important to highlight is that their process of exiting the gang was just that. It was a process, and it was punctuated by various key turning points. One of the things was that when they made a decision to exit, they were able to draw on social support from those around them, and that was really pivotal. But at the same time, they also had agency in this process, and what I mean by that is that they made a conscious decision to exit, and then they were able to draw on support from those around them. Another thing that really supported them, and it's not surprising because they were drawn from a faith-based organization, but religion and access to the support that religion can offer was also really pivotal in their ability to exit. And then the final thing that really stood out for me was this profound transformation in identity that these men experienced, where they moved from being a sort of a stoic, hardened, violent gang member to a much more emotionally aware, sensitive and vulnerable individual, and someone who really wanted to give back to their community or give back to their families. And interestingly, that is what supported them in their ability to maintain that reformed lifestyle.
Dr. Kelly, how did you find the case studies, and how easy or difficult was it for you to actually conduct the research?
Well, I would say with any research, there's definitely challenges, but I was lucky that I had a connection with an organization in the Cape Flats, and that's how I was able to access my participants.
And did you find that they spoke to you freely? Because I understand they wanted to remain anonymous as well.
Yes, so that was actually a decision that I made as well to keep their anonymity protected, because there's often a lot of stigma around gangsterism in the Cape Flats. But at the same time, my experience was that they were very open to talking. They wanted to share their stories with someone. And I think part of that was telling the world, telling other people that they have in fact changed.
And coming from that gangster lifestyle, the environment that supports that, did they find it difficult to adjust to life outside of that? And if so, what are they doing in order to remain sane, as it were, outside of the gang lifestyle?
Absolutely. So there definitely were challenges that they faced after leaving the gang, and that included most of them had been addicted to drugs while they were in the gang. So there's always that temptation to relapse. And when you go back into an environment where those around you are using drugs and engaging in gang activities, that is really difficult. I think also finding employment is another general challenge. And I would say that what helped them to overcome these challenges was that they had people around them who really supported them and who held them. So the literature tells us that when young people join gangs, it's often because they're looking for a sense of belonging and a sense of meaning. And what I found is that when they left the gangs, they found that sense of belonging and that sense of meaning in other ways. So as an example, they found that sense of belonging with their families, with their religious communities, and they found that sense of meaning through becoming involved in various activities within their communities. So as an example, working with other young people who are at risk for joining gangs and trying to help them find another path.
Were there any young women in your research? Because we understand that more and more young women are also being recruited into gangs.
Sorry, I missed the first part of that question.
I wanted to know whether you interviewed any young women as part of your research.
I didn't. So it is something that I considered. And definitely there is evidence to show that more and more women are joining gangs, but I made the decision to just focus on men. Perhaps that would be something I'd look at in the future.
And just talking about that support structure that you mentioned that they say they are holding on to now, where was that support structure as per your research when they actually got lured into the gang activity? Was it there, or is it something that evolved over time where it became available after the fact?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I grappled with. And the way that I made sense of it was that often that support structure was there, but the individual hadn't reached a point where they wanted to change their life. So an example that stands out for me is one of the young men that I interviewed. He actually said to me, you know, there were points during his time in the gang where his mother would come to him and say, you know, please, don't you want to change your life? And he would say to her, no, not now, I'm not ready. So it's kind of this interaction between the individual when they've made a decision to make a change and then drawing on that support that's available. So I think that what that highlights is that it's really important to offer continuous support to people like that, because you don't know when exactly they're going to make that decision to change.
But are they able to ever fully exit the gang, Dr. Kelly? Because if you were a part of this structure for years, you know the ins and the outs, you know the secrets of some other gang members. Do they ever really let you go?
That's another very interesting question and something that I grappled with as well. And I raised it with a few of the men that I interviewed, and the impression that I got was that it depends on how you exit the gang. So if you make a decision to exit and follow a religious path, then the gang members will respect this. So interestingly, it seems as though the gangs themselves actually have an inherent respect for religious institutions. But one of the guys I interviewed also said that the gangs will monitor you and make sure that you actually have changed your life for the good. Another example I got was that if you leave the gang but sort of join law enforcement, then that's a big no-no. So I think it really depends on how you exit.
And what about rival gang members? Do they also monitor what happens to these gang members once they exit their gangs?
I think so, yes. Yeah, that was my understanding.
So from that particular perspective, do they feel safe? You know, even though from their own gangs they may be told if you follow a particular path, we will let you be. But do they actually feel safe, or do they still feel threatened?
You know, that wasn't a question I explored directly with them, but my impression was that, yes, they do feel safe as much as one can, you know, living in the Cape Flats, because it is a very violent place. But I didn't get any impression that they did not feel safe where they lived.
And did you have any interaction at all with the support structures that they rely on now as part of your research?
Unfortunately not. That is, again, something that I considered, and perhaps could be a wider study, because I think it is really important to understand, you know, for example, some of them spoke about turning to family members for help, and I think it would be fascinating to hear from that family member's perspective what that was like for them in helping that person to exit the gang.
Absolutely, and I'm hoping that perhaps you would go there just to get that perspective to, you know, complete this picture. But also, you know, when one is saying saved, as it were. One would imagine you would have the urge to save others along with yourself. Is this something that they spoke about, where they perhaps reach out to some of their former brethren in the gangs?
Definitely. So it might not be that they reach out directly to those that they were in the gang with, but all of them, in one way or another, are working with young people in their community, and they're really passionate about being sort of mentors within their community and trying to say to young people who may be involved in gangs, listen, there is another way. And I think what's really interesting is that it seemed as though that supporting others actually supported them in maintaining that reformed lifestyle, because there was that sense of accountability to other people.
But Dr. Kelly, does the community ever fully accept them back? Because these are people who may have perpetrated crimes against members of their communities. How do the communities respond to gang members exiting their gangs?
I think it really depends on what happens after the person has exited the gang. And again, going back to this idea of giving back to the community. So most of the men I spoke to, although they didn't always say so directly, I think that their involvement in the community and the ways in which they were giving back was sort of ways that they wanted to do that because they knew, and one of the men I spoke to explicitly said this, they knew they had committed violent acts in the past, and they were doing good in their communities now to try and make good for what they had done in the past.
And just a final question. Often gang activity is sustained through crime and the proceeds of crime. How do they support themselves once they exit these groups?
That's another difficult question, because as we know, our unemployment rates are particularly high. I think it really depends on the individual. So some of them were sort of getting stipends through their church. Others had full-time jobs with organizations doing outreach work. There was someone else who was studying while he was in prison and then went on to study, film and media. So I think the idea is that it's I don't want to say anything is possible, but perhaps it is. And like any other person, if they put their mind to it, they really can make a change.
Well, Dr. Jane Kelly, thanks so much for your time this morning and for those wonderful insights. And Dr. Kelly is a psychologist at the University of Cape Town and recently published her PhD thesis on those who leave the gang lifestyle and how they adjust to life after the gang.